Hello everyone, welcome back. We're here for another section of Music 1300. Today we're going to talk about one of my all-time favorite subjects, orchestration and instrumentation. In fact, this bookshelf that you see behind me is full of orchestration and instrumentation texts. So what is orchestration and instrumentation? Well, instrumentation refers to the ensemble that we're listening to, and we've talked a lot about instrumentation already. We've actually traced the development of one entire instrumentation, an instrumental ensemble known as the string quartet. Today we're going to do something of a similar nature. We're going to trace the development of the orchestra. We're going to listen to select pieces from the Baroque era, the Classical era, the Romantic era, and two pieces from the 20th century to explore how the orchestra changes over time. It goes through a number of developments and innovations, and it's mostly due to advances in actual instrumental technology, which is very exciting. So before we begin, one of the things that is handy to have is, of course, a piece of paper for you to take notes on or with. I've also got my one page of lecture notes, which I will toggle over to shortly. And I'll further explain what we will be talking about. So, in fact, let me go ahead and do so. All right, so here's our one page for today. Color driven is our topic. We're going to talk about the expanding orchestra, the harmonic series, and spectral music. So the first thing that we're going to do is stop off at the late Baroque era and talk about the orchestra right at the get-go of the era. As you'll see here, I've listed out the instrumentation for the late Baroque era orchestra. The woodwind family, keyboard family, and string family are present at this juncture. Before this point, we don't have any presence of brass instruments that are really a part of literature or repertoire of the Baroque era. It's mostly an instrumental ensemble that's comprised of the string family. As we discovered from exploring the string quartet, the upper string voices are generally divided out into two, what we call two stands, the first violins and the second violins. There are multiple players on each of these different instruments. Likewise, we have a viola section, a cello section, and a double bass section. Usually the double basses are only one or two players within a section, but that really depends on how many other players you have within the ensemble. The keyboard instruments at this time are really only the harpsichord and the organ. Before this point, the piano did not exist. So we are really only going to hear a very particular timbral or tone color from the keyboard family, and it's usually an instrument that the harpsichord is an instrument we call the continuo, an instrument that needs to continue playing in order to sound because it doesn't have the sustain pedal, something that comes about with the piano later on in the classical era. We do have some presence of woodwind voices, which are very exciting. We've got the flute, the oboe, and the bassoon. Clarinet doesn't make an appearance until the classical era, and part of that is due to Mozart really liking the instrument. Before this point, the clarinet did not exist. So the Baroque era orchestra has a very limited timbral kind of sound, and it's mostly a sound that is heavily emphasizing the string family. So we're going to go ahead and listen to an example from the late Baroque era in order to wrap our ears around what we're listening to. Specifically, again, we're listening to an ensemble that is emphasizing the string family. We're also going to have some other characteristics that are pretty standard for the Baroque era that we've already explored a little bit. So let's think about those areas of music, right? So we've got texture, we have rhythm and meter. So in the Baroque era, we're going to play it very safe. Once a meter is set up for a piece of music, it's going to usually stay in that metric feel for the entire time. Additionally, we're going to have textures that for the Baroque era occasionally rely a little bit more on polyphony, that many melodic lines ongoing at a particular time. That was something that was really stylistic for the Baroque era. And if you think about Baroque art and the way Baroque era architecture even, or fashion looks, it's very ornate in its approach and design, which is something that's really reinforced also with the instrumental music that's happening during the late Baroque era. The texture that becomes most prevalent after the Baroque era, classical era and on, is of course the homophonic texture, which we listened to a number of times so far in our lectures. So we're going to hear some homophonic textures, certainly, therefore also a little bit of heterophony, some call and response between the different ensembles, but also a presence of polyphony that's a little bit stronger than the other eras. So let's go ahead and listen in to what's happening in the late Baroque era orchestra. Okay, here we go. We're going to listen to Haydn, a Baroque era composer, kind of stretches into the classical era. We're going to listen to one of his later works. He wrote over 100 symphonies, but this is towards the 100 mark. This is symphony number 94, which was nicknamed the Surprise Symphony. Haydn ended up getting fairly upset about people falling asleep during his pieces of music. A lot of music at this point was meant as a backdrop to social gatherings. So oftentimes a composer wouldn't necessarily get the attention of the audience that he deserved. So Haydn plays a particularly fun game with dynamics in this piece, going from suddenly very soft to suddenly very loud, in order to be a jarring and awakening event for any of those slumbering audience members. So let's drop into the Andante, the second movement of Haydn's. That's a kind of typical sound of the late Baroque era orchestra. And I'm going to be particular about the period being the late Baroque era, because this starts to exhibit a lot of trends that end up being very popular in the classical era, and that is erring towards homophonic texture instead of polyphonic texture. That's one of the biggest changes that we hear from one era to the next when it comes to the Baroque to the classical. The biggest thing here, though, is that we're listening to an ensemble that's primarily woodwind voices. Woodwind voices when it comes to complementing the string ensemble, which is like the big bread and butter of the entire group. As you saw, it's mostly string instruments. The string instruments are also, like I said, divided into different kind of subcategories. The violins are divided out into two groups. The upper group plays generally the higher notes, and the lower group plays lower notes in order to create more complicated or thicker harmonies, something that is doesn't have as much doubling or people playing the same part. As we go forward, we're going to get more diversity in terms of what sounds and what timbres we're listening to in the ensemble. The era that comes after the Baroque era is, of course, the classical era. And it would be if I have to embody the classical era in just one musical example, it's absolutely going to be Mozart. So we're going to check out a symphony by Mozart, one of my favorites of his, the first movement of Symphony Number 25. It's going to be significantly less polite sounding and have a little bit of a more complexity when it comes to the instrumental colors. Part of this is because of the new instruments that are being developed during this time. Let me go ahead and toggle back over to my lecture notes. Okay, so the classical era, we are right here. The new introduction that we have in the woodwind family is that we have the additional clarinet. The clarinet is new because it has just been invented. And part of the reason that it even withstands the test of time is because Mozart ends up finding it to be a very interesting timbre to work for. He wrote a number of important concertos, or pieces that are for a solo clarinet part with a orchestra that supports that part. So Mozart, being the incredibly important composer that he is, if he wrote important pieces for clarinet, clarinet is going to withstand the test of time. So interesting that composers have an effect on what instruments become popular. Of course, it can go the other way around, but this in particular, I think the clarinet owes something to Mozart in particular. Good. The flute and the oboe and the bassoon are still going to be a part of the woodwind family, but it's now rounded out with the clarinet. The oboe and bassoon, by the way, are double-reeded instruments. They have a kind of particularly nasal sound to them. The flute, on the other hand, is an aerophone, of course, just like the other woodwind instruments. It creates sound with air, but it's a split air column instrument, which means it creates sound by splitting the air column with the presence of a mouthpiece. It is all metal. It has a very metallic sound as well. The clarinet, on the other hand, is a new kind of timbre. It is a single-reeded instrument. It is a lot less nasal sounding than the double-reeded oboe and bassoon. It's a little bit more clean in terms of its sound. It sounds a little woody, though. Not that that's something against its timbre, it's just an observation. Keyboard instruments, some works written for harpsichord during this era, also some works written for piano. So we have this as a transition time for the keyboard family, which is very exciting. Similarly, the strings, we're going to have the same kind of division within the ensemble. However, and most of the emphasis is still going to be within the string family as well, where they're going to be the most in terms of number, and they also get to play the melody most often. Towards the later, mid to late part of the classical era, we start to encounter some brass family instruments. The first brass family instrument that makes an appearance is the horn, or the French horn, which we'll certainly hear within Mozart's Symphony Number 25. So, you'd be surprised what an additional clarinet and horn can do. This piece is also a little bit less polite sounding than Haydn. So let's go ahead and drop in to Mozart and one of his more rambunctious openings and check out what happens in the classical era. Allegro, fast, con brio with brilliance. Got a lot of energy. bit more bravado than we encountered in Haydn. That's the oboe taking a solo. For the most part, we're relying on homophonic texture. We're listening to one melody, in this case, the upper strings, and everything else. The brass have been adding, but they're our Marco solo. Taylor for a moment. Our Marco solo. Oboist is again the soloist. So homophonic texture, oboe is the melody, everything else is accompaniment. We're still in full time, it's just a little bit more withdrawn than before. The big thing here is that we're making use of the string family more than any other family, and all of the other instrumental families, notably the limited brass family and the woodwind family, which is a little bit more expansive, are all supporting the string family. We only had one moment in which we were listening to one of the other instrumental groups as a solo or a feature. And that was that moment that I pointed out with the oboe. Similar kind of profiles that we listened to between Haydn and Mozart, though. Our tempo is consistent. The Mozart piece had a little bit more rubato, that pushing and pulling of time. We still have a lot of dependence on homophonic texture, the idea of listening to melody plus accompaniment. And again, that's something that was going to be very, very popular for the entirety of the classical era and would be dominant for, up until today, of course. But we still heard a little bit of interplay with some heterophonic texture, some call and response with higher and lower string groups, different instrumental families, etc. Great. So as we go forward into the Romantic era and the 20th century, we're going to encounter some more radical changes to the orchestra. So we'll come back for part 2, where we're going to talk about those more extreme variations in sounds and timbres.